In the scorching heat of Arizona, Billy Morrison never imagined his quiet life would be changed by an unexpected bond. With his brother gone and his heart heavy with grief, he never saw himself as a hero. But when a thunderstorm triggers Boston, a battle-scarred German shepherd, it's his 2-year-old daughter Josie who steps forward. With a single word, she halts a dog trained for war. How did this fragile girl calm a protector who had known nothing but violence? The answer will surprise you and change everything Billy thought he knew about love and family. Don't miss the moment that will leave you breathless. Watch now. Billy Morrison had never considered himself special. He lived in a small house in Phoenix, Arizona, tucked between the sprawling desert landscape and the endless sky. The sun was relentless, casting its heat down on the dry streets where Billy spent most of his days fixing cars in the garage he inherited from his father. The work was hard, but it was predictable. Billy liked it that way. It kept him busy, distracted, and away from thoughts that made his chest tighten with guilt. He had always felt like the shadow of his older brother Jake. Jake had been the hero, the Marine who went to war, who died on the battlefield, leaving Billy to pick up the pieces of a life that didn't feel like his own. Billy had never been the brave one. He wasn't the one who wore the uniform. He stayed behind, taking care of the family business, watching the world change around him. And now, even though he had a daughter, Josie, who he adored more than anything, he still couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't enough. Not for her, not for anyone. He had never been the man who made big decisions or faced challenges head on. He had just been there. Josie, however, was different. At 2 years old, she already had a strength that Billy couldn't understand. She had his heart, and she had Jake's eyes. People often said she looked just like him, and Billy didn't know whether to laugh or cry at the reminder of the brother he'd lost. But Josie wasn't just a reflection of her father. She had her own spirit, wild, independent, and full of curiosity. She seemed to see things that others couldn't. And then there was Boston, the German shepherd. At 120 pounds, Boston was a beast, muscular, alert, and always on edge. His past was a mystery to Billy, but the shelter had told him enough. Boston had served in the military alongside Jake, and like so many war dogs, he carried the scars of battle, both physical and emotional. His PTSD was evident, especially in moments of stress, loud noises, sudden movements, things that sent him into a spiral of fear and aggression. But Boston had always been gentle with Josie. He seemed to know she was different too. He was protective of her, always watching over her like a silent guardian. It was the afternoon when everything changed. Billy had been flipping burgers on the grill for a small barbecue. Josie was playing in the yard, her laughter echoing in the dry Arizona air. Boston, as usual, lay in the shade, eyes never straying far from Josie. Everything seemed calm, until a thunderclap shook the ground. Boston's muscles tensed immediately, his ears flattened, his body coiled. A deep growl rumbled from his throat as he rose to his feet, every inch of his being focused on the threat he perceived. Billy dropped the spatula and ran toward them, his heart racing. Josie was too close, and Billy's first instinct was to protect her. But then he saw something that stopped him dead in his tracks. Josie, tiny as she was, walked toward Boston. Without hesitation, she reached out and placed her hand on the massive dog's head. "No," she said, her voice clear and firm. Billy froze. The moment was impossible. Here was his little girl, no more than 2 years old, standing between the war-trained dog and a man who had seen enough violence to know what came next. And yet Boston, a dog who had been trained to attack, froze. He didn't lunge. He didn't growl. He simply stopped. Billy's breath caught in his throat as he watched the dog, once so ready to fight, now sit down at Josie's feet, trembling but controlled. She patted his head as if Boston were just another stuffed animal. "Good doggy," she whispered. The moment hung in the air, and for a brief second, Billy wondered if he was witnessing a miracle. Everyone around them had seen it, but nobody understood how or why it had happened. No one, not even Billy, could explain it. But in that moment, he knew something had shifted. Josie wasn't just a little girl, she was something more. Billy couldn't tear his eyes away from the scene unfolding before him. His heart was still racing, but it wasn't because of the near disaster. It was the realization that something deeper had occurred, something he couldn't quite understand. Boston, the 120-pound German Shepherd, the military war dog, had just been stopped by a 2-year-old girl with a single word. He'd been trained for war, for battle, to strike with the force of a trained weapon, and yet with a gentle touch from Josie, he had frozen. But this wasn't the first time Boston had faced danger. In fact, this was the least violent moment in the dog's long and tortured life. Billy remembered the stories he had been told at the shelter. Stories that Boston never spoke about himself, but that told a tale of trauma, of battles fought in distant lands. Boston had served with Jake, his late brother, in Afghanistan. The dog had been part of an elite K-9 unit trained to find explosives, track down enemies, and protect soldiers on the front lines. But it came with a price. Boston's scars weren't just on his body. They were etched into his mind. The deep, jagged gash across his left side, a reminder of a shrapnel wound from an IED explosion, was just one of the physical reminders of his time in the service. The emotional scars were harder to see. Billy had heard enough about PTSD to understand it wasn't just something the soldiers went through. The dogs, too, carried the weight of war in ways that were both visible and invisible. Billy had seen Boston's triggers before: loud noises, sudden movements, anything that reminded the dog of the battlefield. He would tremble, bark uncontrollably, or retreat into a corner shaking with fear. The first time Billy had seen it, he thought Boston was just another broken animal. But as the days went by, he realized it wasn't just the dog's past that had shaped him. It was the loyalty, the unwavering bond to Jake, to the one soldier Boston had fought beside. The dog had lost his partner just like Billy had lost his brother. When Billy first saw Boston at the shelter, he hadn't intended to adopt him. He had just gone there aimlessly, wandering through the rows of cages, hoping for a distraction from his own mind. But when he laid eyes on Boston, something shifted inside him. He saw the dog's tired eyes, the way he seemed to hold himself together with the tiniest shred of courage left. And Billy knew deep down that Boston needed him as much as he needed the dog. The shelter worker had been hesitant when Billy showed interest. "He's been through a lot," she said, caution in her voice. "This dog's been through hell. He's not just some family pet. He needs someone experienced, someone who can handle his baggage." Billy didn't need to be told twice. He knew exactly what Boston needed: a chance at healing just like him. Billy understood pain, he understood loss. He could relate to the struggle of finding peace after the storm. And though he had no experience with military dogs, he knew he had something more valuable: patience, a quiet home, and a heart open to second chances. So without much thought, Billy made the decision. He would adopt Boston. He would help the dog heal just as he was trying to heal from the loss of his brother. In some strange way, it felt like fate. Billy took Boston home that day, a little unsure but determined. He set up a bed for him in the garage, close enough to the house but separate enough to give the dog space. And in the following days, Billy started seeing the subtle changes in Boston's behavior. He wasn't just a broken animal anymore. He was slowly learning to trust again. Billy watched as Boston stood at Josie's side, his big body protective but gentle, a silent promise that no harm would come to her. The dog wasn't just guarding the house, he was guarding the fragile piece of heart that Billy had been afraid to let anyone see: his vulnerability. He didn't just adopt a dog that day. He adopted a companion, a protector, a piece of his brother Jake that would always be with him. And in the silence of their home, with the sound of Boston's steady breathing, Billy realized he was doing something far more important than just helping a dog recover. He was building a family, one that didn't need to be defined by blood or history, but by the simple act of showing up, of caring, of being there for one another. Billy sat in his quiet home, the dim evening light filtering through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. The gentle hum of the house was interrupted only by the occasional rustle of Boston's fur as the dog shifted in his bed. But Billy's mind was far from peaceful. It was a restless sea of memories, and the weight of one particular memory had been sinking deeper into his chest like a stone thrown into still water. Jake. Billy's older brother, the Marine who had always been the one to make their father proud. The one who wore the uniform, who went to war, and who died in a foreign land before Billy could tell him he was proud. It had been years since Jake's death, but the grief had never truly left him. It lingered like a dark cloud, a constant reminder that Billy hadn't lived up to the legacy Jake had left behind. Jake had been the hero. He had enlisted, fought in wars, earned medals, and died on the battlefield. And Billy stayed home, worked in the family garage, and built a life that felt safe, predictable, but hollow. He had always felt like the second son, the one who wasn't brave enough to serve. He had always looked up to Jake, admired his courage, and envied the way people looked at him, like he was someone important. But Billy couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't. Not in the same way. He wasn't the one who had made the ultimate sacrifice. He wasn't the one who had risked it all for something greater than himself. Billy didn't see himself as a coward, but he did wonder, what if he had been brave? What if he had followed Jake's footsteps? What if he had joined the military, faced the same dangers, and made the same sacrifices? Would he have become the hero his father had always dreamed of? Would he have been enough? But those questions were now pointless. Jake was gone. And Billy was left with nothing but the weight of the life he had chosen. He had played it safe, too safe. There were no medals, no recognition, no stories to tell. Only the quiet, uncelebrated life of a mechanic, a brother who stayed behind. And now, here he was raising Josie. Billy often wondered if he had chosen the right life. He had loved his wife, Melissa, and he had loved Josie since the moment she was born. But there was always that nagging doubt, that feeling that he was just a replacement, a stand-in for someone braver, someone stronger. He had never been the kind of man who sought attention or glory, but in the quiet of his house as Boston lay peacefully at his feet, he couldn't help but feel the sting of inadequacy. What kind of man was he? Not a hero, not a warrior, just a man who loved a child who wasn't really his. Billy's gaze shifted to the picture on the wall, the one of him and Jake, arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning. That was the last photo they had taken together the day before Jake left for his first deployment. Billy remembered the words Jake had said to him that day, "Be safe." Those were the last words his brother had ever spoken to him, and Billy had never told him he was proud. The regret hit him again like a punch to the gut. But as he looked down at Boston, the dog that had fought in wars and survived the worst, he realized something. Maybe being a hero didn't require wearing a uniform. Maybe it wasn't about risking your life on the battlefield. Maybe it was about showing up every day even when it was hard. Maybe being a hero was about loving even when you didn't feel strong enough to do so. And as he looked at the quiet life he had built with Josie, with Boston by their side, Billy started to understand something he hadn't before. He wasn't living in Jake's shadow anymore. He was building his own legacy, a quiet one perhaps, but one that was just as important. He was showing up every single day for the people he loved. Josie had always been a quiet force in Billy's life. At 2.5, she had a wisdom beyond her years, something in the way she watched the world and processed everything around her. There were moments when Billy would catch her studying things with an intensity that reminded him so much of Jake. Her eyes, the same bright blue as his brother's, always seemed to see more than they let on. It was in the way Josie would sit and gaze at the stars, or how she hummed melodies to herself, that made Billy think she might understand the world in a way he couldn't quite grasp. Billy had often wondered if she somehow carried Jake with her, if some part of him lived on in her. She looked like him, she had his eyes, but there was something more, something intangible that Billy couldn't explain. It wasn't just about the way she resembled Jake physically. It was in the way she moved through the world in her quiet confidence, and the way she could calm even the most tense situation. And then there was Boston. Billy had seen how the dog seemed to follow Josie's every move, his amber eyes always alert, but not in the usual way. There was something protective in his gaze, something more than just the instincts of a war dog. It was as if Boston recognized something in Josie, something that made him stay by her side, watching over her, as if she were the most important thing in the world. It was a bond that Billy couldn't quite explain, but he couldn't ignore it either. The connection between them was undeniable. One afternoon the world seemed to hold its breath. The sun was dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard as the summer heat began to wane. Billy had just finished mowing the lawn when a loud clap of thunder broke the silence. The storm had come out of nowhere, the air thick with tension. Billy looked up to see Boston standing rigid, his muscles tense, ears flat against his head. The dog was always on edge during thunderstorms, his PTSD kicking in as soon as he heard the first rumble of thunder. His body coiled like a spring, ready to lash out in defense against an unseen enemy. Billy froze, stepping toward the dog, ready to intervene if necessary. But before he could get closer, Josie appeared from behind the garage, her tiny frame moving with surprising confidence. She walked toward Boston, who was now growling low in his throat, his eyes wide with fear. But Josie wasn't afraid. She reached out her small hand and gently placed it on Boston's massive head. "No," she said, her voice clear and calm. Billy watched in disbelief. Boston, the dog that had been trained to attack, who had survived bombings, explosions, and violence beyond what Billy could imagine, stopped instantly. The low growl faded into nothing. Boston's body, once tense with aggression, relaxed. He sat down on the ground, his eyes softening as if he were in a trance. Josie, her expression serene, patted the dog's head. "Good doggy," she whispered. Billy's heart skipped a beat. He knew Boston. He knew how this dog had reacted to threats in the past. He had seen the dog nearly tear through walls when startled by the sound of gunfire or a backfiring car. But this was different. This wasn't just a trained animal obeying commands. This was something else, something far beyond Billy's understanding. The thunder rumbled again, but Boston no longer seemed bothered. He lay down at Josie's feet, a silent guardian, as if he had always known she would be the one to calm him. Billy stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to move. He couldn't explain what had just happened. In that moment, Billy saw it clearly. Josie wasn't just a little girl with her mother's smile and her father's eyes. She was something more. There was a depth to her, a connection to the world around her that Billy couldn't comprehend. And there at her feet was Boston, a dog who had survived the worst of humanity's violence, but who had found peace in the presence of a child who wasn't even old enough to understand what she had just done. Billy stood frozen, watching the scene unfold before him, his mind racing to make sense of it all. Boston, the war dog who had known nothing but violence and survival, had just let Josie tame him with a simple word. The connection between them was undeniable. Billy had always known that Boston was more than just a dog. He was a soldier, a protector, and a survivor. But this was something different. Boston had always been a guarded animal, his instincts trained to protect and fight. His past was filled with the kind of violence that could break a person's spirit, but here he was, sitting at Josie's feet, calm and controlled. It was as if he had found peace, something Billy had never seen in the dog before. And it was all because of Josie. Billy glanced at Josie, her small hands still resting gently on Boston's head. She wasn't afraid. She never was. There was a quiet confidence in the way she held herself, as though she knew she had the power to calm the fiercest storms. She was just a child, but there was something about her, a wisdom, a knowing, that made Billy believe she was capable of things far beyond her age. As Josie patted Boston's head again, Billy felt a lump form in his throat. The love he felt for her had always been there, but in this moment it was as if a door had been opened inside him, a door he hadn't even realized was locked. He hadn't just loved her out of obligation or because she was his daughter. He loved her because she was his, because he had chosen her just as she had chosen him. The realization hit Billy hard, like a wave crashing against a jagged shore. Love wasn't about blood. It wasn't about the ties that bound you to your family by name or by heritage. It was about the connections you built, the moments you shared, and the choices you made. Billy hadn't needed to be Josie's biological father. He hadn't needed to be the one who gave her life. What mattered was that he was the one who had been there, the one who had stayed, the one who had loved her every day in every small way. As he watched Josie and Boston, he realized something else too. Boston wasn't just a dog, he was a bridge, a connection between Billy and the family he had lost, between the man he had been and the father he was becoming. In some strange, inexplicable way, Boston had become part of their family, not just as a dog, but as a protector, a guardian of what mattered most. Billy had always felt like an outsider in his own life, like a man living in the shadow of his brother's legacy. But in that moment, as he watched Josie, Boston, and the life they had built together, Billy felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. He wasn't just the man who had stayed home while Jake went to war. He wasn't just the man who worked on engines, fixed cars, and lived in the quiet suburbs. He was a father. And in that quiet, unexpected moment, he realized that he didn't need to be Jake to be a hero. He just needed to show up. Billy had never been one to let fear control him, but as he stood in the quiet of his home, the weight of it all began to settle on his chest. The life he had so carefully built with Josie and Boston felt fragile now, as though it could slip away at any moment. The realization that he was the one who had chosen to be Josie's father hit him deeply. But with that realization came the fear of losing her. It wasn't just about what had happened with Melissa, his late wife. The memories of her were always bittersweet. How she had fought her own battles, how her struggles had shaped Josie's arrival into the world. The pain of losing her was something Billy carried every day, though he rarely spoke of it. What haunted him now more than anything was his inability to save her. The guilt weighed on him like a shadow that never quite disappeared. But now the fear wasn't just about the past. It was about the future. Josie had become everything to him, his reason for waking up each day. He had promised himself that he would be the father she needed, but the thought of losing her, of failing her the way he had failed Melissa, left a pit in his stomach that wouldn't go away. Billy couldn't shake the feeling that things were changing between them. As much as he wanted to believe that he was enough, there were moments when doubt crept in. Could he really protect her? Could he really be the man she needed when so much of his own life had been filled with uncertainty and regret? It was during one of those long, quiet evenings that the reality of his fear hit him. Josie was playing outside, her laughter filling the air as she ran around the yard with Boston at her side. The dog, always protective, kept a careful eye on her, his ears perked at every sound. Billy was watching from the window, his heart still heavy, when a figure appeared at the edge of the yard. It was a man, someone Billy didn't recognize, walking too close to their fence. At first, Billy didn't think much of it. Just another neighbor, maybe, or someone passing through. But then the man stopped. He looked at Josie, his gaze lingering in a way that made Billy's stomach turn. He didn't like the way the man's eyes followed Josie, the way he seemed to be watching her every move. Billy's instincts kicked in. He wasn't sure why, but something in the man's presence felt wrong. He grabbed his jacket and hurried outside, his pulse quickening as he approached the yard. "Hey, Billy," called out, trying to sound firm, but the man didn't react. He just stood there, still watching Josie. Billy's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't lose her. Not like this. He didn't know what the man's intentions were, but he knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't let anything happen to Josie. "Josie," Billy shouted, this time more urgently, pulling her attention away from the stranger. Josie looked at him with confusion, but she didn't hesitate. She ran toward him, Boston trotting along behind her, his body low and his eyes alert. Billy reached Josie just as the man took a step forward. "Who are you?" Billy demanded, his voice firm but trembling. The stranger finally turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "Just a passerby," the man said, though his voice lacked the calmness of someone with innocent intentions. Billy didn't trust him. Not for a second. His eyes flicked to Boston, who was now standing protectively in front of Josie, his body tense. The dog wasn't aggressive, but Billy could tell that something was off. Boston was responding to the same danger Billy sensed. Without thinking, Billy stepped forward, keeping Josie behind him. "I don't want you here," he said, his tone no longer polite. The stranger seemed to weigh the situation for a moment before taking a slow step back. "Fine," the man muttered, turning and walking away without another word. Billy didn't move until the man was out of sight. He felt the adrenaline start to wear off, replaced by a lingering sense of unease. What had just happened? Was it just a coincidence, or was there something more? As he looked down at Josie still holding her close, he realized one thing for certain. The fear he had tried to ignore for so long was real. He was afraid of losing her, afraid of the dangers that lurked outside their little world. And for the first time, he understood the depth of that fear. It wasn't just about protecting her from the outside world, it was about protecting his heart. Billy hadn't even finished locking the door behind him when he heard the knock. A sharp, insistent tap that made his heart skip. He glanced at Josie, who was coloring quietly at the kitchen table, oblivious to the tension that Billy could feel tightening in his chest. He opened the door to find a man standing in front of him. Tall, with cold eyes that reminded Billy of someone who had spent too many years holding grudges. The man didn't need to introduce himself. Billy recognized him immediately. Silas Mercer, Josie's grandfather, stood there, his presence commanding and stiff as if he had walked straight out of one of Billy's worst nightmares. Billy had heard the stories, of course. Silas had been a shadow in their lives ever since Melissa had passed, but this was the first time he'd shown up uninvited. And Billy knew that whatever this man wanted, it wasn't going to be easy. "I need to speak with you about Josie, Silas," said his voice as cold as the look in his eyes. Billy's instincts flared, but he kept his voice steady. "She's not here right now." "Is there something I can help you with?" Silas stepped forward, his face hardening. "I'm not here to talk about what you can do for her. I'm here to talk about what you can't do. You're not her father, Billy. Not really. And you've never been." The words hit Billy like a punch to the gut. He didn't have to ask what Silas meant. The man's disdain was as clear as it was cutting. "You don't know anything about me," Billy said, his voice tight, the anger rising in him. "And you sure as hell don't know anything about Josie." Silas ignored the remark. He stepped into the doorway, towering over Billy. "I'm not blind," he continued, his voice growing louder. "I know what you're doing here. You've played father. You've pretended to be the man she needs, but you're not him. You'll never be him." Billy clenched his fists, holding back the rush of emotions that surged through him. His first instinct was to shut the door to make Silas go away and never come back. But Silas wasn't finished. "You're just a man who stayed behind. While my son was out there serving his country, he was the hero, Billy. And you're just the one who was there when the hero was gone." Billy stood frozen. The words cut deep, and he could feel the weight of Silas's words crashing against his chest. It wasn't the first time he had heard them, but it hurt just as much. The man's voice trembled with the bitterness of loss, and in a way Billy could understand that pain. But he wasn't about to let Silas use it against him. "Josie is mine," Billy said, his voice quieter but firm. "And you will not take her from me. She's been my daughter long before you walked through that door." Silas looked at him, his face a mask of resentment. "She's not yours, Billy. She's Jake's. And you are just the man who happened to be in the right place at the right time. You didn't earn that right. You didn't fight for it." Billy felt the flood of emotions threaten to break free, but he stood his ground. "I am her father. And no matter what you say or do, that won't change." Silas's expression hardened, and a dark plan began to unfold in his mind. "We'll see about that," he muttered, turning to leave. "I won't let you ruin her life with your lies. The truth will come out. And when it does, you won't be able to hide behind that little girl anymore." Billy slammed the door behind him, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind raced with the consequences of what Silas had just said. He couldn't let Josie's life be torn apart by this man's bitterness. But Billy knew that Silas would do whatever it took to force him out of Josie's life. The storm rolled in without warning. The sky, once bright and clear, quickly darkened, casting shadows over the house. A heavy wind began to whip through the desert, rustling the dry leaves and sending them swirling in chaotic spirals. Billy could hear the rumble of thunder in the distance, but the sound grew louder, and the air became thick with the smell of rain and electricity. Billy stood by the kitchen window, watching the storm roll in, his thoughts still tangled around the conversation with Silas. He could still feel the sting of the man's words, still taste the bitterness of his anger. It was hard to escape that constant feeling of inadequacy, of being the replacement, the second choice. But as he stood there, something else grabbed his attention. A sudden sharp bark broke through the howling wind, and before Billy could react, Boston was on his feet, pacing in the living room, his eyes wide, his ears pinned flat against his head. The dog's body was rigid, muscles coiled for action. "Boston, calm down," Billy muttered, moving toward the dog, but he didn't seem to hear. The storm had triggered something deep inside Boston. The sounds of thunder, the pressure in the air. It was all too much. The dog let out a low growl, his tail stiffened, and he started circling around, eyes locked on a figure standing by the door. Billy turned to see his friend Danny standing in the doorway, one hand holding a six-pack of beer, the other wiping the rain from his brow. "Hey, I figured I'd come by to hang out," Danny said, grinning despite the storm. But Boston wasn't having it. The dog's body tensed, his growls growing louder with every step Danny took toward him. The low rumbling from his chest was full of aggression, a stark contrast to the calm energy the dog usually exuded around Josie. "Boston," Billy shouted, but it was too late. Boston was already moving toward Danny, his teeth bared, ready to protect. Billy's heart raced. He knew Boston's instincts. He had been trained for combat, but it was hard to predict what would happen in these situations. This wasn't just about protecting the house. This was about something deeper, something Billy couldn't explain. "Boston, stop," Billy commanded, but his voice was drowned out by the storm and the rising tension in the room. The dog's eyes were filled with fear and anger, emotions that seemed to be spiraling out of control. But then Josie appeared. She had been playing in the living room, her little feet pattering softly across the floor. She didn't hesitate for a second. Without a word of fear or hesitation, she walked directly to Boston. "Boston, no," she said, her voice soft yet firm, a quiet command. The room fell silent. Boston stopped in his tracks mid-lunge. The growls faded and the dog stood motionless, his muscles still but trembling. Josie's tiny hand reached up to gently touch Boston's massive head. "No, good boy," she whispered, her tone calm, almost as if she were speaking to a friend. Billy's breath caught in his chest as he watched the impossible unfold. Boston, the battle-hardened dog who had been through so much, had stopped on command. Her command. The connection between them was clear now more than ever. This wasn't just a dog and a child. It was something far deeper, something inexplicable. Billy looked at Josie in awe. She was only 2 years old, but in that moment she had managed to calm a dog trained for war, a dog who had never been easy to control. Boston sat down at her feet, his body still trembling but now calm. Josie patted his head once more, her face serene. Danny, still standing in the doorway, let out a nervous chuckle. "I've never seen anything like that," he said, glancing from Billy to the dog. Billy could only nod, still processing what had just happened. There was no doubt in his mind now. Boston had a bond with Josie, one that went beyond training or instincts. It was something instinctual, something protective. It was like the dog knew deep in his soul that this child was someone worth protecting. Billy knelt down next to Josie, his heart swelling with love and gratitude. He didn't have all the answers, but in that moment he realized something crucial. Josie wasn't just a little girl with big eyes and a beautiful smile. She was something special. And Boston. He wasn't just a dog. He was family, a protector, a part of a bond that Billy couldn't have understood before. The next few days felt like a storm waiting to break. Billy couldn't escape the weight of Silas's words, the threat that lingered like a shadow over their home. Each time he glanced at Josie, so innocent and full of life, the fear would rise again. He hadn't asked for any of this, yet here he was, caught between his love for the little girl who had become his world and the man who seemed determined to tear that world apart. Silas had made it clear that he wouldn't back down. The phone call had come early that morning, the voice on the other end cold and authoritative. "Billy, you have until the end of the week to make a decision. If you refuse to step aside, I'll be forced to take legal action. You don't have the right to keep her." Billy had tried to steady his voice to hold on to the calm he had worked so hard to build. "She's my daughter, Silas. I'm not going anywhere. You're not her father. You never will be. You're just the man who happens to be there. I've been patient, Billy, but I'm done waiting. The line had gone dead after that, leaving Billy with a feeling of helplessness that he hadn't experienced in years. How had everything gotten so complicated? How had the simple act of loving Josie turned into a battle for her very future? Billy felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff ready to fall. He didn't know what to do next. He had never been a man of legal battles of paperwork or threats. He was just a mechanic, a father trying to keep his little girl safe. But now it felt like everything was spiraling out of his control. Every decision he made seemed to be another step closer to losing Josie. And then there was Boston. The dog that had once been nothing more than a war-wounded animal, a survivor of the worst humanity had to offer, had become something far more. He was Josie's protector. His presence was a shield, a constant reminder that she wasn't alone. Billy had watched as Boston had calmed Josie's fears, as the dog had defended her without a second thought. Boston had stood by Josie through every storm, both literal and emotional. And now Billy knew that Boston wasn't just a dog. He was more. He was part of their family, and in a strange, powerful way, he was the glue that held everything together. Billy's fear for Josie only deepened with each passing day. He had never felt so powerless, so unsure of how to protect her. Silas had a way of manipulating the system, of twisting the truth to suit his own agenda. Billy knew he was no match for him in a legal fight, but he wasn't going to back down. He couldn't. Not when Josie's future was at stake. The storm that had been brewing inside him grew louder, crashing against the walls of his mind. What if he lost her? What if Silas succeeded in taking her away? Billy couldn't bear the thought. Josie had already been through so much in her short life, losing her mother, losing the man who should have been her hero. He had promised to be there for her, to give her a life filled with love and safety. But now everything he had worked for seemed to be slipping through his fingers. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden bark from Boston, followed by a low growl. Billy snapped to attention. Boston's alertness had been growing in recent days, his instincts constantly on edge, as though the dog knew something was wrong, something was coming. Billy's heart raced. He couldn't ignore the sense of impending danger. Something was happening, and he wasn't sure what it was. But he knew one thing for certain: he had to protect Josie, no matter the cost. The days following his confrontation with Silas were a blur of unease and suspicion. Billy couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening just beneath the surface, something he wasn't seeing. His protective instincts had never been more alive, especially with Josie. But it wasn't just Josie he needed to protect now. It was Boston, too. Billy's mind raced, replaying the conversation with Silas over and over. The threats, the manipulation, it all felt like a game Silas was playing. But what was the real objective? Why was Silas so determined as to push him out of Josie's life? What was at the root of his obsession? He couldn't stop thinking about Boston. The dog had been with him through thick and thin, from the moment he'd adopted him, a battered war dog with a violent past. But Billy had seen the quiet moments too, the way Boston calmed Josie with nothing more than his presence, how he protected her without a second thought. This dog wasn't just a pet. He was family. Billy needed answers, and he wasn't going to wait around for Silas to make the next move. He started to dig, reaching out to anyone who might have information on Silas's history and connections to Jake's past. He started with old military contacts, friends of Jake's, who might know about his last missions. The more he dug, the clearer it became. Silas wasn't just a grieving grandfather. He was a man with a purpose, one driven by something darker than family love. Billy found himself in the dusty, neglected corners of Jake's life that he had never fully explored. There were mentions of Silas in Jake's personal notes, always vague, always hidden between more urgent matters of the war. But the more Billy pieced together, the more he realized that Silas's obsession with control wasn't just about Josie, it was about something much bigger. A conversation Billy had overheard in the garage 2 days ago began to make more sense now. A name had come up, someone who had worked with Jake in his final months before he was killed. It was a name Billy didn't recognize, but it was enough to lead him to another contact, an old friend of Jake's who had been part of his last mission. This man, a retired military officer, confirmed what Billy had feared. Silas had been in contact with a network of people tied to Jake's final investigations, military contractors, and even some from the smuggling ring Jake had uncovered. And there it was. Silas had orchestrated a plan not just to take Josie from Billy, but to cause chaos and paint Boston as a threat to everyone around him. Billy's blood ran cold as he listened to the details. Silas had hired someone to trigger Boston's PTSD to create situations that would make the dog seem unpredictable, even dangerous. He had hired someone to purposely set off Boston's war instincts to make people think the dog was a ticking time bomb. The thought of it made Billy's stomach turn. How could anyone use a dog like that, manipulate him to create chaos? Billy had seen the scars, the trauma, the memories Boston carried. To use that against him, to twist the dog's suffering into a weapon, was a cruelty Billy couldn't comprehend. Billy's first instinct was to confront Silas right away, but he knew better. This was bigger than a simple argument. It was a calculated move, and if he wasn't careful, Silas would succeed in making Boston a weapon against them all. The dog who had been their protector, their guardian, could become their downfall in Silas's twisted game. Billy knew what he had to do. He couldn't let Silas win. He had to protect Boston, protect Josie, and expose the truth. There was no turning back now. He would have to confront Silas with everything he had learned, expose the lies, and stop the damage before it was too late. Billy took a deep breath, looking at Boston, who lay quietly by the door watching him with calm, trusting eyes. "We're gonna fix this, old boy," Billy murmured. "You've done your part. Now it's my turn." Billy couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was at play. The more he pieced together, the more his stomach twisted. Silas had been methodical, calculating. He wasn't just trying to gain custody of Josie, he was trying to destroy everything Billy had built with her. His first move had been to discredit Billy, but his second was far more insidious. Silas had set out to make Boston appear dangerous. The dog who had been nothing short of loyal, a protector, in every sense of the word, was now being painted as a threat. Billy felt sick thinking about it. How could Silas use Boston's trauma as a tool for his own agenda? The dog had already fought the demons of war. He had lived through the unimaginable, and now, after being adopted by Billy, had finally begun to heal. But Silas, in his grief, was determined to turn the dog into a weapon against them. It was the ultimate betrayal. Billy had spent days trying to make sense of the puzzle, speaking to neighbors and friends. It didn't take long for him to hear the whispers. People had begun talking about Boston, not in the way Billy had hoped, not as a guardian or protector. No, they were talking about him like he was a ticking time bomb. There were stories, half-truths, exaggerations, about Boston's behavior. A neighbor had claimed Boston had lunged at a delivery man. Another said the dog had growled menacingly at a child at the park. Each incident, no matter how small or misinterpreted, had been twisted to paint Boston as an uncontrollable animal. Billy's heart sank as the realization hit him. These weren't accidents. These incidents had been engineered. Silas had deliberately triggered Boston's PTSD, exposing him to loud noises, sudden movements, and smells that sent him back to his combat training. Silas had planted these triggers in the hope that they would push Boston past the breaking point, and it was working. Slowly but surely, Billy saw the cracks forming in the foundation of the life they had built. Billy felt a surge of anger, a fire rising in him that he hadn't felt in years. How dare Silas do this? How dare he manipulate a dog who had already been through hell? And worse, how dare he use Josie as a pawn in his game? Billy knew what he had to do. He couldn't let Silas win. He had to expose the truth, bring everything to light before it was too late. With newfound determination, Billy began gathering his evidence. He called in experts on PTSD, spoke to the neighbors who had witnessed Boston's behavior, and reached out to the shelter for more details about the incidents that had been reported. The truth had to come out. Billy wasn't going to let Silas use Boston to tear apart his family. He wouldn't stand by while Josie's life was destroyed by someone's grief and jealousy. Boston's loyalty had never wavered, and now it was time for Billy to return that loyalty. He would protect Boston just as Boston had protected him and Josie. The world would know the truth about the dog who had been a hero in ways no one could understand. Billy stood in the living room looking at Boston, who was lying quietly at his feet. "We've got this," Billy whispered, running his hand over the dog's head. "I won't let him take you from us." The courtroom felt like a battleground, the air thick with tension. Billy sat at the table, his back straight, his hands clenched into fists on either side of the papers in front of him. Silas was seated across from him, his expression a mask of cold determination. Billy knew what was coming. Silas had made it clear that he wouldn't stop until he had Josie. And for the first time in his life, Billy was ready to fight for something bigger than himself. "Your Honor." Silas began, his voice low and deliberate. "I'm not here to make trouble. I'm here to make sure my granddaughter is raised properly. Billy Morrison has never been fit to raise Josie. He's a mechanic, a man who stayed behind when my son went to war. He's not her father. He's not the man she needs." Billy felt a fire ignite within him. He stood up, his voice steady but forceful. "I am her father." Billy said, his words clear and resolute. "I've been there for Josie every single day. I've loved her since the moment she came into this world. I'm the one who changed her diapers, who kissed her scraped knees, who stayed up at night to make sure she was okay. I don't need to be Jake to be her father." The words hung in the air, and for a moment Billy could feel the weight of them. This wasn't just about legal documents, this was about love. The kind of love that wasn't measured by blood, but by actions, by sacrifices, by showing up every day, even when it was hard. Silas's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with fury. "You can't replace Jake. You'll never be the father she deserves." Billy didn't flinch. "No, I can't replace Jake," he said, his voice softening slightly. "But I'm here. I'm here for Josie, and I'll always be here. That's what matters." As the argument continued, the tension between them grew. Billy stood his ground, every word he spoke, a reminder that being a father wasn't about medals or heroic acts. It was about the quiet moments, the small acts of love and devotion. Josie didn't need a hero. She needed someone who would be there for her every single day, someone who would protect her even when it wasn't easy. And through it all, Boston stood at Billy's side as if to remind the court of the loyalty that went beyond words. The dog wasn't just a weapon in Billy's defense. He was a living testament to the bond Billy had built with Josie. Boston's steady presence throughout the trial was a silent statement of what family really meant. Billy turned to look at Boston, whose amber eyes never left him. The dog's calm demeanor spoke volumes in a way words never could. Billy wasn't fighting for himself, he was fighting for Josie, for their future, for the family they had built. And in that moment, he realized that this was what it meant to be a father. It wasn't about the past or what people expected. It was about the here and now. It was about showing up no matter the cost. Billy had just finished his morning coffee when the letter arrived. It was tucked into an envelope, plain and unmarked, but the moment Billy saw the name on the return address, his stomach dropped. It was from Jake. He sat down at the kitchen table, his hands shaking slightly as he tore open the envelope. The faint smell of old paper and dust wafted from it, a scent that reminded him of all the times Jake had been away, of the letters Billy had never written, and the things left unsaid between them. The handwriting inside the letter was unmistakable. Jake's familiar scrawl. Billy's heart ached as he read the words, "Billy, if you're reading this, I'm probably gone. There's something I need to tell you, something that's been weighing on my heart for a long time. I've known for a while now that Josie would need someone to take care of her, someone who would love her the way I would if I could. I know you've always felt like you're not enough, like you're living in my shadow, but that's not true. You've always been enough. And I need you to be strong for her to step up and to love her like she's your own. She's yours, Billy. You've always been her father, even before I left." Billy stopped reading for a moment, his throat tight. The words seemed to echo through his mind, replaying in his head like a mantra. You've always been her father. He had known in his heart that he had loved Josie as his own, but hearing it from Jake, his brother, his hero, was like a wave crashing over him. All the doubts, all the insecurities he had carried with him for so long melted away in that moment. Jake had known somehow that Billy would be the one to raise Josie. That thought hit him like a ton of bricks. Jake, who had lived with the burden of being the family's hero, had seen something in Billy that Billy himself had never been able to see. He had known that Billy was capable of loving Josie with the same depth, the same devotion, the same strength that he had loved his own family. Billy wiped a tear from his cheek, not even realizing it had fallen. His heart swelled with a mixture of relief and grief. The words in Jake's letter gave him the comfort he didn't know he needed. Jake had believed in him. Jake had chosen him even before he had died. The weight of the letter seemed to dissolve the final remnants of Billy's doubt. He wasn't just the man who had taken care of Josie out of necessity or obligation. He wasn't a stand-in. He was her father. And he had been chosen for that role not by circumstance, but by love. Billy looked over at Boston, who was lying at his feet, quietly watching him. The dog had always been there, a silent protector, a companion on the journey. Boston had helped him see that it wasn't just about blood. It was about the bond they had created together, the family they had built. Billy took a deep breath, his chest filling with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt before. "You've always been her father." Jake had written those words, but they were true for Billy now. They weren't just words on paper, they were his truth. Billy folded the letter carefully and set it down on the table, the weight of it still heavy in his hands. He knew what he had to do now. He wasn't going to let Silas tear apart the life he had built with Josie. He would fight for her, for their future. And this time he knew he was doing it with everything he had. Billy sat at the table, his fingers tracing the edges of the letter as if the words could still be alive, still pulsing with the truth Jake had known all along. He had read it over and over, trying to internalize the weight of what Jake had written, what Jake had always known. That Billy had always been the one meant to raise Josie not by blood, but by choice. The truth seemed simple enough in writing, but Billy knew it was more complicated than that. It had taken him years to realize it, to understand that being a father wasn't about the circumstances of birth, but the choices made in the everyday moments of love, sacrifice, and care. It was those quiet, ordinary acts of devotion that built the strongest families, not the loud proclamations or heroic feats. Billy's thoughts drifted back to his childhood, to the family he had grown up in. He had always been the quieter one, standing in the shadows of Jake's larger-than-life presence. Jake had been the hero, the son their father had always dreamed of. Brave, bold, always ready to fight for something greater than himself. Billy had never been that. He had always been the one who stayed behind, who held the family together when Jake had gone off to war. But it had never felt like enough. It had never felt like he was really living up to his potential. But now, as he thought about Josie, about the life they had built, he understood that he didn't need to live up to anyone's expectations but his own. He had made his own choices, and those choices had led him to this moment, this life with Josie. It wasn't about being a replacement for Jake. It was about being the father Josie needed, even if that meant doing things differently from what he had imagined. Billy knew he had chosen this life. He had chosen Josie, chosen to raise her as his own, even though she wasn't his by blood. And he had chosen Boston, who had become more than just a dog. Boston was part of their family now. He was the protector, the companion, the silent witness to everything Billy had done for Josie. Billy looked up at the dog, who was now resting his head on his paws beside him. Boston's amber eyes met Billy's as if understanding the weight of the moment. The dog had always been there through the quiet times, the hard times, the times when Billy had questioned his own worth. And through it all, Boston had stood by him just as he stood by Josie. It was clear now that the bond they shared wasn't just between a man and a dog. It was a bond forged by love, loyalty, and the choices they had all made together. The storm outside had passed, but the storm inside Billy was still raging. He was no longer just the man who had been left behind. He was a father. And that meant something more than just sharing blood with a child. It meant being there for them no matter what. It meant standing up for them when the world tried to tear them apart. As Billy looked at Josie, who was now sitting on the couch with her stuffed rabbit smiling up at him, he realized just how much he had come to love her. Not because he had to, but because he chose to. He had chosen to be there for her, to protect her, to love her in every way a father should. And now with the truth of Jake's letter echoing in his mind, Billy knew one thing for sure. He wasn't just raising Josie for Jake. He was raising her for himself, for their future. The day Billy had been dreading finally arrived. He stood at the door, Boston by his side, his heart heavy with the weight of the confrontation he was about to face. Silas had been a constant shadow in his life, the man who could never accept him, the man who had once been his father-in-law but now stood as a bitter adversary. But today things would be different. Billy had thought about this moment for days, even weeks. The words he would say, the way he would stand his ground, how he would defend Josie, how he would finally put an end to Silas's manipulation. But as the door opened and Silas stepped inside, Billy saw something in the older man's face he hadn't expected. It wasn't just anger or hatred. It was sorrow, deep sorrow that Billy had never seen before. "Billy," Silas said quietly, his voice hoarse, "I've been a fool." Billy couldn't help but stiffen. He wasn't sure how to respond to that. For so long he had viewed Silas as the antagonist, the man who stood in the way of everything he had worked, for the man who had dismissed him as nothing more than a replacement for Jake. But now, standing in front of him, Silas seemed smaller somehow. He wasn't the enemy Billy had imagined. "I don't understand," Billy said, his voice cautious but curious. "All this time you've been trying to take Josie from me. Why?" Silas looked down, his face tight with emotion. "Because I was angry," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "angry at losing Jake, angry that I couldn't protect my family. And when I saw you, Billy, all I saw was a man who had never been brave enough to stand up for anything, and I hated you for it." Billy's chest tightened. It was the same feeling he had carried for years, the feeling that he wasn't enough. But now, listening to Silas, he realized that it wasn't about him at all. It was about Silas's grief, his unresolved pain. Silas had never known how to deal with his own loss, and in that darkness, he had turned it all on Billy. "I'm sorry," Silas continued, his voice raw. "I didn't know how to handle it. I thought if I could just take Josie away, maybe I could fill the hole that Jake left. But it wasn't about her. It was about me." Billy took a step closer, his own anger beginning to fade. For the first time, he saw Silas not as an enemy, but as a man who was broken by grief, a man who had never learned how to cope with loss. The realization hit him hard. Silas had been acting out of his own pain, and in doing so, he had hurt everyone around him. "You don't have to apologize to me, Silas," Billy said softly. "You need to make peace with yourself, with what happened to Jake, with your loss." Silas's eyes filled with tears, but he nodded. "I was wrong. I see that now. Josie, she's better off with you. You've been the father she needed all along. I've been too blind to see it." Billy looked down at Boston, who stood silently by his side, ever watchful, his amber eyes focused on both men. It was clear that the dog had sensed the change in the air, the shift in the tension between Billy and Silas. Boston's protective nature, his unwavering loyalty to Josie and Billy, was a reminder of what family truly meant. "Boston's been my protector," Billy said, his voice full of emotion. "And he's been yours too, Silas. He's a reminder of the love and loyalty that goes beyond what we see with our eyes. It's about what's inside. You were always a part of Josie's life, whether you realized it or not, and I know that deep down you've always wanted what's best for her." Silas nodded, a single tear slipping down his cheek. "I'm sorry for everything, Billy. You've earned your place in Josie's life. I can see that now." Billy stepped forward, offering his hand. "Let's put the past behind us, Silas. For Josie, for Jake." Silas hesitated, then took Billy's hand. The tension that had held them both captive for so long seemed to dissolve in that moment. "Thank you," Silas whispered. "I won't get in your way anymore. I see now that you're the father she needs." Boston, sensing the change, stepped forward, placing his head gently against Billy's leg. The dog's presence was a comforting weight, a reminder of the bond that had been forged through love and loyalty. In the days that followed his confrontation with Silas, Billy found himself focused more than ever on the simple, beautiful moments with Josie. The storm had passed. both the literal one outside and the emotional one that had raged inside him for so long. There was a calmness now, a peaceful rhythm to their life together that Billy hadn't realized he'd been craving. Josie, who had always been a bright light in his life, seemed to shine even more in the wake of the storm. She had always had a way of seeing the world with wonder, her eyes wide with curiosity, her laughter a melody that could chase away any darkness. But now there was something deeper in her, a quiet understanding. She had grown not just in age but in heart, and Billy felt as though he was seeing her in a new light every day. They spent mornings together sitting at the kitchen table with bowls of cereal, their laughter mixing with the quiet hum of Boston's presence by the door. Billy had never imagined that being a father would feel so natural, so right, but with each passing day it became clearer Josie was his, not by accident, not by obligation, but by choice. As they played in the backyard, throwing the ball for Boston, Billy couldn't help but marvel at how well they all fit together. Josie would run after the ball, her hair flying behind her like a golden halo, while Boston, steadfast and loyal, always kept pace with her. The dog had never left her side, and it wasn't just about the physical protection he offered. It was the unspoken bond they shared, one that ran deeper than Billy could ever have imagined. Boston wasn't just Josie's guardian, he was her confidant, her silent companion, through every moment of joy and discovery. One afternoon, as Billy watched Josie lean down to whisper something to Boston, words that made the dog's tail wag furiously, and he felt a lump rise in his throat. It wasn't just that Boston had been a protector or that he had been a constant source of comfort for Josie. It was the realization that they had built something together. A family, yes, but more than that, a foundation based on love, sacrifice, and loyalty. Billy knew now that these were the things that truly mattered. Not the battles, not the struggles, not even the names or bloodlines. What mattered was being there, showing up, choosing each other every day. Through every trial, every challenge, they had learned to lean on each other to be each other's strength. Boston, come here. Josie giggled, patting the ground beside her. The dog bounded over his large body, landing beside her with a soft thud. Josie's small hand reached out, stroking the dog's fur, a bond that was nothing short of magical. Billy watched them, his heart full, as Josie's innocent smile spread across her face. Billy stepped forward, squatting beside them. "You're growing up, kiddo," he said softly, brushing a stray lock of hair from Josie's face. Josie grinned, looking up at him with those familiar blue eyes that now held a depth that made Billy ache. "I'm going to be just like you, Daddy," she said, her voice matter-of-fact. Billy's heart swelled with pride, but there was something else too, a quiet fear. What if one day she didn't need him in the way she did now? What if the world outside took her from him, or if things changed in ways he couldn't predict? But in that moment, as she reached for his hand and pressed it to her cheek, he realized that those fears didn't matter. What mattered was now. Right now, Josie needed him, and he would be there for her. Always. The lessons of love, sacrifice, and loyalty were etched deeply into their lives. Billy didn't need a grand declaration of heroism, nor did he need to be perfect. He just needed to be present to choose love every day. And Boston, steady, unwavering Boston, remained at their side, the silent sentinel who never asked for anything yet gave everything. The days that followed felt like a slow, steady calm settling over Billy's life. It was the kind of peace that crept in quietly without fanfare, but with a weight that Billy had never fully appreciated until now. He didn't need to look for it, didn't need to force it. It came naturally, a result of the choices he had made, the love he had given, and the family he had built. Billy no longer questioned his place in Josie's life. There were no more lingering doubts about whether he was enough. He had always been her father, not by blood, but by choice, and with every passing day that truth settled deeper into his heart. It was in the small moments, the mornings when Josie would wake him with a sleepy smile and a kiss on the cheek, the evenings spent on the porch with Boston, lying at their feet, watching the stars slowly take over the sky. Billy no longer felt the need to search for something to validate his role. He didn't need a label or recognition. He didn't need to compare himself to the heroism of his brother or to Silas's judgment. Josie needed him, and that was enough. The way she looked at him with that unspoken trust made every hardship, every moment of doubt worth it. Billy wasn't just her father. He was the one who had chosen to stay. The one who had been there day after day without question, without hesitation. The peace he felt now was something he had longed for but had never known how to find. It wasn't about achieving success or having a perfect life. It was about presence, about being there for Josie when she needed him most. He had chosen her, chosen to be the father she needed, and in return, she had chosen him. And Boston, steady, ever-watchful Boston, remained a constant. The dog was a reminder of everything they had built, everything they had fought for. He was more than just a protector. He was a living, breathing embodiment of loyalty and love. Through Boston's calm, patient presence, Billy was reminded of the strength of their bond. The bond they had formed not through blood, but through shared experiences, sacrifices, and unconditional love. Billy had come to understand that family wasn't about how you were related to someone. It wasn't about where you came from or what you shared in terms of genetics. Family was about the people who showed up, the people who chose to stand by each other through thick and thin, who loved without expecting anything in return. It was about loyalty, sacrifice, and the deep connection that came from truly being present in someone's life. The lessons of love and sacrifice continued to unfold for Billy. Each day brought a new reminder of the power of choice. The choice to love, to protect, to stay. It was a quiet power, one that didn't demand attention but changed everything in its wake. He had chosen Josie and she had chosen him. Together they had created something beautiful. And so life went on in a peaceful rhythm, the love that surrounded them unspoken but understood. Boston remained their silent guardian, their protector, as Billy continued to embrace his role as a father. There were no grand gestures, no heroic moments, just the quiet, steady presence of a family that had chosen each other. Billy sat quietly in the backyard, staring at the horizon as the sun began to dip behind the mountains. The world around him seemed to be at peace. Gentle breezes ruffled the leaves of the trees, and Boston lay beside him, his head resting on his paws. Josie was inside playing with her toys, the soft hum of her laughter drifting through the open window. For the first time in a long while, Billy felt the weight of his own thoughts settle quietly in his chest. He had come a long way since that first day he had brought Josie into his home, a child with no blood relation to him yet, who had become everything. The fear that had gripped him so tightly in the beginning, the fear of not being enough, of losing her, of not being the father she needed, had started to fade slowly and without fanfare. He wasn't sure when it happened or how, but one day he had realized that it didn't matter if he wasn't the hero like Jake. It didn't matter if he hadn't been the one to give Josie life. What mattered was that he had chosen her, and she had chosen him. But still, there were moments when the fear crept back in, whispers of doubt and insecurity that threatened to drown him. He thought of Melissa, the love he had lost, and of Jake, who had died in the line of duty, never to see the daughter who carried his blood. There were days when the grief of those losses still lingered in his heart, like an old scar, one that had never fully healed. Yet, as he sat there now, with the sounds of the world around him, Josie's laughter, Boston's soft breathing, he realized something important. He had faced that fear day after day. He had carried it with him, and though it had never fully disappeared, he had learned to live with it. He had learned to move forward, to be present, to choose love despite the uncertainty. And in doing so, he had discovered his own strength. He had chosen Josie, and she had chosen him. That was the only truth that mattered. Billy looked down at Boston, who raised his head, his amber eyes meeting his. The dog's calm presence was a comfort, a reminder that love didn't need to be spoken to be felt. It was in the quiet moments, the shared silences, the gestures of protection and care. Billy knew that he wasn't alone in this. He had Josie, he had Boston, and together they were enough. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath as he let go of the last remnants of fear that had been holding him back. It was time to stop looking over his shoulder, to stop questioning whether he was enough. He was enough. And this right here was his family. The morning sun filtered through the window, casting a soft glow across the kitchen table where Billy sat enjoying a rare, quiet moment with Josie. She was still in her pajamas, her blonde curls tumbling messily around her face as she concentrated on drawing a picture of a dog, a family, and a house. It was the simple things like this that brought Billy peace, these small, everyday moments that grounded him. But today, Josie seemed to have something on her mind. She put down her crayons, her eyes suddenly serious as she looked up at Billy. "Daddy," she began, her voice soft and uncertain. "What about my real daddy?" Billy paused, his heart skipping a beat. The question was one he knew would come eventually, but that didn't make it any easier. Josie was old enough now to start wondering about her past, to realize that things weren't quite as simple as they seemed. Billy took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. He had always known that he would have to tell her the truth, about Jake, about the man who was her biological father, and about the life that had led them here. He had been putting it off, afraid of how it would change things, but he knew now that it was time. Time for Josie to understand the full story. Time for her to know who she was and where she came from. "Your real daddy." Billy began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. His name was Jake. "He was my brother. He was a hero, Josie. He went to war to protect people, to make sure they were safe. He loved you before you were even born, and I loved him too. He was the best man I ever knew." Josie's eyes widened slightly, taking in the words. She didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at Billy as if trying to understand everything he had just told her. Billy continued, his words coming easier now, the fear slowly melting away as he spoke from the heart. "Jake never got to meet you, sweetheart. He died before you were born. But he knew about you. He knew you were coming, and he made sure I would be here to take care of you, to love you like my own. And that's exactly what I've done." Billy smiled softly as Josie's small hand reached out, touching his arm gently. The child, so innocent and so full of love, seemed to understand more than her young age should have allowed. She didn't look sad or confused, just thoughtful. "I love you, Daddy," she said, her voice sincere and clear, as if she knew the depth of the words she spoke. Billy felt his heart swell, his eyes misting slightly. "I love you too, sweetheart. I always will. You are my daughter no matter what." There was a quiet moment as Josie leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder. It was in that moment that Billy realized that the family they had built wasn't just enough. It was everything. They had created something beautiful together, built on love, loyalty, and the simple act of showing up for each other day after day. He was no longer questioning his place in Josie's life. He had a purpose, a reason to wake up each morning with a heart full of love. And beside them, Boston lay at their feet as always, watching over them both with a quiet, steady presence. The dog had been their guardian, their silent protector through everything they had faced. The afternoon light poured into the room, casting soft shadows as the three of them sat together, wrapped in a peaceful silence. Billy, Josie, and Boston. Family. It was simple, and yet for Billy it felt like the most beautiful thing in the world. The bond they had created wasn't defined by names or labels, but by love, understanding, and the quiet moments they shared. They had built a home filled with laughter, comfort, and the kind of loyalty that was stronger than blood. Billy looked down at Josie, her head resting against his shoulder, her tiny hand curled in his. Her blonde curls were slightly messy, her face still holding that look of innocence and wonder. There was no rush in her movements, no hint of the fear that once haunted Billy. She had settled into her role as his daughter, as if she had always belonged there, and he had settled into his role as her father, finally understanding that this was where he was meant to be. In the corner, Boston lay stretched out on the floor, his eyes half closed, his breathing slow and steady. The dog had been a part of their journey from the very beginning. And now more than ever, Billy realized how much Boston had given to their family. He wasn't just a protector, he was a symbol of their resilience, of the strength they had built together. The dog had stood by them in their darkest times and had been the silent force that kept them grounded. Billy's heart was full, and for the first time in years he didn't feel the weight of his past. He didn't feel the shadow of what he had lost or the uncertainty of what lay ahead. He only felt the warmth of the present, the love that surrounded him. Josie's small voice pulled him out of his thoughts. "Daddy, I like when we're together like this," she said, her voice soft and content. Billy smiled, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "Me too, sweetheart. I wouldn't trade it for anything." In that moment, he understood something that had eluded him for so long. The idea of family, of being enough, had always been clouded by his doubts. But now as he looked at Josie, the little girl who had come into his life and changed everything, he realized that family wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about blood or expectations. It was about love. The kind that held you up when you couldn't stand on your own. The kind that fought for you. The kind that chose you every day no matter what. Josie had chosen him, and he had chosen her. They had built something that was theirs, something that no one could take away. And Boston, steady, unwavering Boston, was a constant reminder of that. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow across the room. It was peaceful, the kind of peace that came from knowing you were exactly where you were meant to be. Billy didn't need anything else. He didn't need validation or approval. He didn't need to be anything other than what he was: a father, a protector, a man who had chosen to love and be loved in return. Billy closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, feeling the calm settle into his chest. For the first time in years, he felt truly at peace. The past was behind him, the future uncertain, but right now in this moment, he had everything he needed. Josie stirred in his arms, her eyes fluttering open. She looked up at him, her small hands reaching for his face. "I love you, Daddy." Billy kissed her forehead, his voice thick with emotion. "I love you too, Josie. Always." Together they sat there, the three of them, and family united by choice, by love, and by the bond they had formed. It was the perfect ending to a journey they had begun, not knowing where it would take them, but trusting that as long as they had each other, they would be okay. And in the soft glow of the setting sun, Billy knew that everything was right. This was home. This was family. This was where they belonged. In the end, this story is a testament to the power of love, loyalty, and the incredible bond between humans and animals. It's a reminder that family isn't defined by blood, but by the connections we build, the choices we make, and the love we choose to give. Billy, Josie, and Boston prove that a true family is formed not through shared genes, but through presence, dedication, and unconditional love. Boston, the German Shepherd, exemplifies the depth of this bond. Known for their intelligence, loyalty, and protective nature, German Shepherds are more than just pets. They become guardians, companions, and even healers. In this story, Boston's unwavering loyalty to Josie, his protection, and his deep connection to Billy illustrate the profound impact animals can have on our lives. These remarkable dogs are not only skilled protectors, but also offer emotional support, comfort, and an unspoken presence that grounds us when we need it most. Through this journey, we see how Boston's loyalty mirrors the love and commitment Billy has for Josie. Together, they form a family built on trust and sacrifice, showing us that the strength of love lies in its consistency, even in the face of hardship. The message here is clear. Love transcends all boundaries. It is a force that connects us, strengthens us, and ultimately defines what it means to be truly part of a family. The values of empathy, compassion, and the joy of caring for those we love, whether they walk on 2 legs or 4, are at the heart of this story. And in every act of kindness, we create a bond that cannot be broken.